He was fired for helping an elderly man with a flat tire and lost everything. But the next day, a black car stopped in front of his door, and he couldn't believe what he saw. The alarm rang sharp and shrill, filling the tiny apartment with its persistent noise. Harv slapped the button, silencing it. He sat up slowly, blinking against the dim morning light that filtered through the worn curtains. The room was cramped, an old dresser missing a handle, a small table with a chipped mug, and his mother's room right across. He rubbed his eyes, pulling himself together. Another day, another shift at the mall. He tiptoed to his mother's room. She was still asleep, her breath shallow but steady. Harv walked over to the small nightstand, his eyes scanning the line of orange prescription bottles. He picked one, the label half torn. He shook out 2 pills, poured a glass of water, and set it on the stand. Then he gently shook her shoulder. "Ma, wake up, time for your meds." Her eyes opened slowly, the dullness in them hard to ignore. She gave him a faint smile, then took the glass and swallowed the pills. Her hands were frail, the skin paper thin. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. Harv nodded, his expression staying neutral. He checked the time. He had 15 minutes to get ready. He left the apartment, locking the door behind him. The stairwell smelled like mildew and something sour, and the elevator had been broken for weeks. Harv took the stairs, his steps echoing in the empty building. Outside, the sky was overcast, the streets damp from last night's rain. He walked briskly to the bus stop, feeling the cold air prick at his face. His thoughts moved automatically to bills, rent, overdue medical expenses piling up, and barely anything left after buying his mother's meds. He let out a slow breath, trying to shake the tension from his shoulders. The ride to the mall was uneventful, his eyes staring blankly out of the window as the city blurred by concrete buildings, the occasional neon signs still flickering from the night before, and a few people starting their day. Just like him, Harv entered the mall through the staff entrance. The hallway smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. He clocked in, grabbed his security vest, and scanned the schedule posted on the wall. Nothing unusual, just the regular rounds, watching cameras, checking the parking lot. He could already hear Mr. Richards' voice in his head, telling him to stick to the rules. He walked into the security office, where Mr. Richards was standing, arms crossed. "Harv, Miss Richard," said his voice, carrying that familiar edge. "I need you on your AM today. I don't want any mistakes, understand?" "Yes, sir," Harv answered, his voice flat. "Good," Mr. Richards said, his eyes narrowing. "Remember, we're watching, no wandering off, no distractions." Harv nodded again. Richards always made it clear, one wrong move, and he'd be out. Richards turned, continuing to talk to the other guards. Harv watched him, his jaw clenching for a moment before he put on his best blank expression. He grabbed his radio and headed to his assigned post. Hours passed in a monotonous flow. Harv stood by one of the mall entrances, nodding at shoppers, watching as kids dragged their parents toward the toy store. The usual crowd, the usual noise, nothing out of place. The static of his radio crackled now and then, voices talking about lost kids or in backup to escort an unruly customer out. When his shift moved to the parking lot patrol, Harv let out a sigh of relief. He liked being outside, even if it was cold and gray. Less noise, less crowd. He walked slowly along the rows of cars, keeping an eye out for anything unusual, though he didn't expect much. Mostly bored teenagers trying to lure, or someone struggling with their bags. That's when he noticed the old man. He was standing by an SUV, staring down at a flat tire, his face a mixture of frustration and helplessness. The guy was struggling, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his other hand fumbling with his phone. Harv paused. He wasn't supposed to leave his patrol area. The rules were simple, no leaving, no exceptions. But the old man looked up, meeting Harv's eyes for just a moment. And there was something there, a mix of panic and pleading. "Damn it," Harv muttered under his breath. He approached the old man, who was still struggling with his phone. Harv offered a quick smile. "Need some help with that?" he asked. The man looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "Yeah, son, I could use a hand. I can't get this thing to work, and I'm not sure I can change that tire myself." Harv nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Don't worry, I got you." The SUV was heavy and the jack wasn't the best, but Harv worked quickly, keeping an eye on his surroundings. He knew this was breaking the rules, and he knew Richards would have something to say if he caught wind of it, but he couldn't just walk away. "Thank you," the old man said, leaning against the car. "You're a good kid." "What's your name, Harv?" he said, tightening the last bolt. He gave the tire a quick shove to make sure it was on right, just doing what anyone would do. The man shook his head. "Not everyone would help, trust me on that." As Harv finished, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. One of the mall's security cameras was pointed straight at him. He tried not to think about it, tried not to let it show on his face. He forced a smile and helped the old man back to his feet. "There you go," Harv said, brushing the dirt off his pants. "You're good to go now." "Thank you, Harv," the man said again, his voice sincere. "If there's anything I can do to repay you," Harv shook his head quickly, "just get home safe." "All right," the old man nodded, slowly getting into his car, still offering a grateful wave. As he drove off, Harv watched until the car disappeared around the corner, then turned back toward the mall entrance, his stomach in knots. He had a feeling he'd be paying for this soon enough. When he walked back into the security office, Mr. Richards was waiting. He didn't say anything, just watched as Harv returned his radio. The silence was thick, and Harv could feel the weight of those eyes following him out of the room. He clenched his jaw, heading to the locker room. His shift was over, but he knew tomorrow wouldn't be easy. Helping someone had never felt so heavy before, and the knot in his chest didn't seem like it would be loosening anytime soon. Harv woke up the next morning to the familiar beeping of his alarm. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment, remembering yesterday's events. His stomach sank, but there was no time to dwell on it. His mom needed her meds, and he still had a job, at least for now. He repeated his morning routine, making sure his mom took her pills and giving her a reassuring smile. She patted his arm, looking at him with a knowing gaze. "Everything all right, baby?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah, Ma," Harv said, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine. Don't you worry about anything." He kissed her forehead before heading out. He didn't have the heart to tell her what was coming. He left the apartment, locking the door behind him, and made his way down the stairs. The same damp smell in the stairwell, the same gray sky outside. Harv pulled his coat tighter around him, his mind racing with thoughts of Mr. Richards. The bus ride felt longer today, his nerves tightening with every stop closer to the mall. When he finally arrived, he headed to the employee entrance. The same dull hallway, the same clock-in machine. Harv swiped his card and walked to the security office, his heart pounding a little harder with each step. Mr. Richards was there, standing by the door, arms crossed, his face expressionless. Harv felt his stomach twist as their eyes met. "Harv," Richard said, his voice flat. "Office." Now Harv nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He followed Mr. Richards into the small office, the door clicking shut behind them. Mr. Richards didn't sit, he just stood staring at Harv with that cold look that made the hairs on the back of Harv's neck stand up. "Do you know why I called you in here?" Richards asked, his tone icy. Harv shifted on his feet. "I think I got an idea." Richards' eyes narrowed. He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. A monitor on the desk flickered to life, showing security footage from the parking lot. Harv watched himself on the screen, helping the old man with the tire. "You know the rules, Harv," Mr. Richards said, his voice tight. "You're not paid to leave your post. You're paid to stay in your designated area and follow orders." Harv opened his mouth to speak, but Richards held up a hand. "Let me make this very clear," Richards continued. "I don't care why you did it. I don't care if that old man needed help. You left your post, you disobeyed a direct rule, and you were caught on camera doing it." Harv clenched his jaw, feeling his pulse quicken. "He needed help, sir. I couldn't just ignore him." Richards let out a small, humorless laugh. "Oh, you couldn't, huh? And who's going to pay for the liability if something happened while you were off playing hero?" Harv felt a flush of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I just did what I thought was right." "Well, what you thought was right cost you your job," Richard snapped. He pulled a paper from the desk, sliding it across to Harv. "This is your termination notice, effective immediately." Harv stared at the paper. The words blurred for a moment, and he felt a strange numbness spread through his chest. He looked back up at Richards. "That's it," Harv said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I helped someone, and I'm out." Richard shrugged, his lips curling into a smirk. "That's how it works, Harv. You're a liability. Now we don't need liabilities." The words hung in the air as Harv stared at the paper. He felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and fear all swirling in his chest. He grabbed the paper, his fingers tightening around it. "Fine," Harv said, his voice steady though his heart was racing. "I'll be out of your way." Then Mr. Richards nodded, almost looking satisfied. "Turn in your badge and uniform before you leave." Harv didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and left the office, feeling the weight of the stares from the other guards. As he walked by, no one said anything, no one even made eye contact. He knew they were afraid that speaking up would make them the next target. He went to the locker room, his movements robotic. He took off his vest, folded it neatly, and placed it in his locker. He took out his badge and stared at it for a moment before setting it on top of the uniform. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter, but he forced himself to stay calm as he walked out of the mall for the last time. The cold air hit his face, making everything feel more real. He paused for a moment, looking back at the building just yesterday. It had been his job, his way of keeping things together for his mom. Now it felt like a door slamming shut. He turned away, walking to the bus, stopped. The wind picked up, biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was too full of fear, full of anger, full of questions. He didn't have answers to. He thought of his mom sitting at home, depending on him. He thought of the rent, the medical bills, the endless pile of responsibilities. The bus ride home was a blur. He barely noticed the people around him, the chatter, the sound of the engine rumbling beneath him. When he got off at his stop, he walked slowly back to the apartment, building his feet heavy. He climbed the stairs, each step feeling harder than the last. He paused outside his mother's door, taking a deep breath. He couldn't let her see how bad it was. He had to be strong for her. Harv opened the door, stepping inside. His mother looked up from her chair, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Hey baby," she said, her voice soft. "How was work?" Harv forced a smile, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It was all right, Ma," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Just a long day." She nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You look tired. Come sit down. I made some tea." "Yeah, Ma, that sounds good," Harv said, his voice cracking just slightly. He sat down beside her, taking the cup she offered. He stared at the steam rising from the tea, his mind racing. He needed a plan. He needed something, anything to keep them afloat. But for now, he just sipped the tea, nodding along as his mother talked about her day, doing his best to hide the fear gnawing at him. The next morning, Harv sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills that felt like they were suffocating him. His mother was still asleep, and the apartment was quiet, too quiet. The eviction notice was on top, the bold letters almost mocking him. He pushed the papers aside, rubbing his face with his hands. He needed a plan, but right now everything seemed impossible. He decided to get out. He needed fresh air, and sitting in the apartment only made him feel worse. He slipped on his coat, careful not to make too much noise, and headed out the door. The cold air was sharp against his skin, and he pulled his collar up. He walked with no real destination, just moving, letting his feet guide him. He ended up near the mall, and without really thinking about it, he walked towards the entrance. Harv knew he shouldn't be here. He wasn't supposed to come back, not after getting fired, but something pulled him towards the parking lot. He stood at the edge of it, looking at the rows of cars. It was quiet now, just a few shops coming and going. His eyes landed on the spot where he had helped the old man. The memory played out in his mind. The tire, the thanks, the way Mr. Richards had looked at him. Later, his fists clenched. "Hey, Harv." Harv turned, startled by the voice. It was Tony, one of the younger guards from the mall. He looked nervous, glancing around before stepping closer to Harv. "What are you doing here, man?" Tony asked, keeping his voice low. "Richards said you shouldn't be coming around." Harv shrugged, trying to play it off. "Just passing by, needed some air." Tony nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of worry. "Look, I shouldn't be talking to you, but I heard what happened. The guys in the office, they all knew it was wrong. Richards, though he doesn't care." Harv gave a bitter smile. "Yeah, I figured as much. It's all right, Tony. I knew what I was getting into when I stopped to help." Tony shifted, looking around again before leaning in. "I wanted to say, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. I mean, I don't have much pull or anything." But his voice trailed off, and he looked embarrassed. Harv patted Tony on the shoulder. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it. But I think this is just something I got to handle on my own." Tony nodded, looking down at his shoes. "Yeah, I get it. Just take care of yourself." "All right, yeah, I will," Harv said, turning away. He could hear Tony's footsteps heading back inside, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to do something, but standing here wasn't it. He made his way back home, the knot in his chest tightening with each step. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, pausing for a moment outside the door. He could hear his mother coughing inside, and it made his heart ache. He opened the door, slowly stepping inside. "Ma," he called softly. She was sitting on the couch, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked up, giving him a weak smile. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice raspy. "Where'd you go?" "Just out for a walk," Harv said, moving over to her. He sat down beside her, placing a hand on her arm. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged, her eyes tired. "I'm all right, just a little tired today." Harv nodded, his gaze dropping to the stack of bills on the table. The weight of it all felt crushing. His mom, the eviction notice, the medical expenses. He needed to find a way out of this. And soon the next few days blurred together. Harv spent most of his time searching for jobs, any jobs. But every security company he went to knew about his misconduct. It didn't seem to matter that he had just been trying to help someone. All they saw was a liability. He filled out application after application, even for jobs. He was overqualified for supermarkets, delivery driver positions, anything. But so far, nothing. He walked back to the apartment. One afternoon, his feet dragging. His mother's health had been getting worse, and every day without insurance made him more nervous. The landlord had been by again, knocking on the door and reminding him of the rent. Harv had just stood there nodding, trying to explain that he was working on it. The landlord had just sighed and walked away. Harv's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing a number he didn't recognize. "Hello," he answered, his voice cautious. "Is this Harv Mullister?" a woman's voice asked on the other end. "Yes, this is Harv," he said, his brows furrowing. "This is Junk Hospital. I'm calling regarding your mother's account." The voice continued, professional but cold. Harv's heart sank. "What about it?" "Well, we have received notice that the insurance linked to your mother's care has been terminated, and as such, any ongoing treatments will need to be paid out of pocket." Harv's stomach twisted. There must be some kind of mistake. I lost my job, but I thought there'd be some kind of grace period or something." "I'm afraid not, sir," she said. "If you'd like to discuss payment options, I can transfer you to our billing department." Harv closed his eyes, the phone feeling heavy in his hand. Yeah, okay. He was transferred, and the conversation that followed left him feeling more hopeless than ever. The numbers they threw at him were impossible, and every option they gave seemed like a dead end. He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket, and stood there for a moment, staring at the cracked pavement. That night, Harv sat at the kitchen table again, the bills spread out in front of him. His mother was in her room, resting. He stared at the eviction, noticed the hospital bills, the overdue rent. His hands shook slightly, and he clenched them into fists. He had one thing left of value, his father's car. It wasn't much, but it was something he didn't want to do it. That car was all he had left of his dad, a man he barely remembered, but selling it would buy him some time. It would pay for his mom's meds, maybe keep them from getting evicted. Harv took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to do this. There wasn't another option. He'd find a way to make it work. The next morning, Harv got up early, slipping out of the apartment while his mom was still asleep. He drove the car to the nearest pawn shop, parking out front, and just sitting there for a moment, he rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the faded dashboard. Memories flickered in his mind. His dad taking him on drives when he was a kid, the way his mom would smile in the passenger seat. He shook his head, pushing those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to be sentimental. Not now. Harv walked into the pawn shop, the bell above the door jingling. As he entered, the man behind the counter looked up, giving him a once-over before nodding. "What can I do for you?" the man asked. Harv cleared his throat. "I need to sell a car." The man raised an eyebrow. "Got the title with you?" "Yeah," Harv said, pulling the paperwork from his pocket. The man took the papers, looking them over. He glanced out the window at the car, then back at Harv. "It's not in the best shape, but I can give you a few hundred for it." Harv's heart sank, but he nodded. "That's fine." The man shrugged, grabbing a clipboard. "All right, let's get the paperwork started." Harv walked out of the pawn shop with cash in his pocket and a hollow feeling in his chest. He walked back to the apartment, the money feeling like both a lifeline And a wait it would help, but it wasn't enough, not for long. He needed a real solution, not just another band-aid. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, opening the door. Quietly, his mom was awake, sitting in her chair, and she looked up when he entered. "Hey, baby," she said, her eyes tired. "Where'd you go?" Harv forced a smile, holding up the groceries he'd picked up on the way back. "Just grabbed some stuff we needed. Figured I'd make breakfast." She smiled, her eyes softening. "You're too good to me, Harv." He shook his head, moving into the kitchen. "And Ma, I just do what I can." As he started making breakfast, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had to find a way to fix this. He had to keep going no matter what. Harv sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills again. It was early morning, and his mother was still asleep in her room. The apartment was quiet save for the sound of the neighbor radio blaring faintly through the thin walls. He had been up all night, trying to come up with a solution, anything to keep them from losing the apartment, or from his mother getting worse without her medication. The cash from selling his dad's car was sitting on the table. Had counted it at least 10 times, and each time it felt like less. It wouldn't even cover the hospital bills, let alone rent. Harv rubbed his face, exhausted, his eyes dry and gritty. He knew he needed help, but there was no one left to ask. The landlord knocked on the door that morning, his fist heavy against the wood. Harv opened it, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Morning, Harv," the landlord said, glancing past Harv into the department. "Look, I don't want to do this, but I need that rent. You're 3 weeks overdue now." Harv nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, Mr. Perez. I'm working on it. I just need a little more time." The landlord sighed, his eyes softening just a bit. "You know I like you, kid, and I get it, times are tough. But I got bills too, you understand. I can give you another week maybe, but after that..." He let the words hang in the air. "Finished?" Harv swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I understand." Mr. Perez gave a small, sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry, Harv. I really am. Just do what you can." "All right." Harv nodded again, closing the door. As Mr. Perez walked away, he leaned against the door for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had a week to figure something out. Later that day, Harv decided to try one more time. He put on the only decent clothes he had left, a button-down shirt and a pair of slacks that were a little too tight. Now he grabbed a stack of printed resumes and slipped them into a folder. He kissed his mom on the forehead before heading out, telling her he'd be back soon. She smiled at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with trust. "Good luck, baby," she said, her voice soft. "I know you'll find something." He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Ma, I will." He walked through the city, stopping at every place that had a help wanted sign in the windows: supermarkets, warehouses, fast food places. He handed out his resume, answered questions, tried to look confident, but the answers were all the same: no openings, no callbacks. Even when they didn't ask about his previous job, they seemed to see something in him, a desperation, maybe, that made them turn him away. Harv found himself at the security agency downtown, the same place he'd applied to when he first got the mall job. He hesitated at the door, knowing what would likely happen, but he pushed it open anyway. He walked up to the desk, and the receptionist looked up, her eyes briefly meeting his before flickering to the side. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "Yeah," Harv said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm looking for a security position. I used to work at the mall, but I'm looking for something else now." The receptionist nodded, taking his resume. "I'll see if someone can talk to you." Harv sat in the waiting area, the minutes dragging by. His leg bounced nervously, and he could feel the eyes of the other applicants on him. Finally, a man in a suit came out, holding hairs. "Resume, Mr. Mallister," he called. Harv stood, his palms sweating, as he followed the man into a small office. The man gestured for Harv to sit, and then he sat across from him, flipping through the resume. "Looks like you have some experience," the man said, his tone neutral. "But I see here that you were let go from your last job." Harv nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. I left my post. Help an elderly man in the parking lot. He had a flat tire and couldn't change it himself. I know it was against policy, but I couldn't just ignore him." The man raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You understand that leaving your post is a serious issue in this line of work, right? Liability is everything." Harv nodded again, his heart sinking. "I understand, sir, but I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help." The man sighed, setting the resume down. "I appreciate your honesty, but I'm afraid we need guards who can follow protocol. Liability is a real concern, And we can't take risks with that. Harv felt the hope drain from him, but he forced himself to smile. I understand. Thanks for your time. The man gave a small nod, and Harv stood leaving the office. He walked out of the building, the rejection echoing in his head. He had known it would happen, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. He needed this job. He needed something, anything to hold on to, but it felt like every door was slamming shut. The sun was starting to set by the time Harv made his way back home. He walked slowly, his feet heavy, his eyes downcast. He turned the corner onto his street, and then he stopped. A car, a sleek black car, was parked in front of his building. Harv frowned, squinting at it. He watched as the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. It was the old man from the parking lot, Mr. Thompson. Harv's heart skipped a beat, and he blinked, not sure if he was imagining it. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes landing on Harv, and he smiled, waving him over. Harv, he called, his voice warm. Harv walked over, his mind racing. Mr. Thompson, he said, his voice full of confusion. What are you doing here? Mr. Thompson smiled, leaning against his car. I came to find you, son. I asked around, and I heard what happened after you helped me. Harv felt his face flush. Yeah, I lost my job, he said, his voice low. But it's all right, I'll figure something out. Mr. Thompson shook his head, his expression softening. You shouldn't have lost your job for doing the right thing, Harv. And I've been thinking about that ever since you helped me when no one else would, and I owe you for that. Harv frowned, his heart pounding. I mean, I appreciate it, Mr. Thompson, but I don't know what you could do. Mr. Thompson smiled again, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a business card. He handed it to Harv, who took it, staring at the logo printed on it, Thompson Security Services. I own a private security company, Mr. Thompson said, his voice calm. We're always looking for good people, people with integrity, who do the right thing even when it's hard. I want you to come work for me. Harv's eyes widened, and he stared at Mr. Thompson, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Are you serious? He stammered. Mr. Thompson nodded. I'm dead serious, son. I need people like you on my team. The kind of people who don't just follow the rules, they follow their hearts. Harv felt a lump rise in his throat, and he swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Say yes, Mr. Thompson said, his smile widening. Come work for me. I promise you won't regret it. Harv looked at the card again, then back at Mr. Thompson. He felt something shift inside him, a spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in weeks. He nodded, his voice shaking as he spoke. Yes, I'll do it. Mr. Thompson clapped him on the shoulder. Good, come by the office tomorrow morning, and we'll get you started. And don't worry about your mom. We'll make sure she's taken care of too. Harv's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away, trying to keep his voice steady. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you so much. Mr. Thompson smiled, nodding. You're welcome, Harv. Now go take care of your mom. We'll handle the rest. Harv watched as Mr. Thompson got back into his car and drove away, the black car disappearing down the street. He stood there for a moment, the business card clutched tightly in his hand, his heart pounding for the first time in what felt like forever. Harv felt like maybe, just maybe, think we're going to be okay. The next morning, Harv woke up early, his heart beating with a mixture of anxiety and cautious optimism. He glanced at the business card on the nightstand, Thompson Security Services, printed in bold letters. Mr. Thompson's offer seemed almost too good to be true, but it was his best shot, maybe his only shot. He quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake his mother. He had spent the entire night replaying Mr. Thompson's words in his head, the promise of a job, the hope for something better. He pulled on his clothes, the same slightly tight button-down shirt and slacks, smoothing them out as best he could. He needed to make a good impression, even if Mr. Thompson already knew him. "Man, heading out early," Harv whispered as he peeked into his mother's room. She stirred, her eyes opening just a sliver. "Where you going, baby?" she mumbled, her voice heavy with sleep. "Got a job interview," he said, smiling softly. "Something good, I think. Don't worry, I'll be back soon." She smiled, her eyes closing again. "That's my boy," she whispered, her voice drifting off as she fell back to sleep. Harv walked to the bus stop. The early morning air cold and crisp. The streets were quieter at this hour, a few cars passing by, their tires hissing on the damp asphalt. He clutched the business card, rubbing his thumb across the embossed logo, as if to reassure himself that it was real. The bus arrived, And Harv climbed aboard, finding an empty seat by the window. He watched as the city moved by the buildings and people, a blur, his heart pounding with anticipation. He got off in front of a sleek office building downtown. The sign outside read Thompson Security Services, and seeing it made Harv's chest tighten. He walked through the front doors, stepping into the bright, clean lobby. The receptionist looked up, her smile warm. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked. Harv cleared his throat, suddenly feeling out of place. "I'm here to see Mr. Thompson. He told me to come by this morning." The receptionist's smile widened. "You must be Harv. Mr. Thompson mentioned you let me call him." "Just a moment." She picked up the phone, speaking quietly into the receiver. A moment later, she nodded at Harv. "He'll see you now. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor, and he'll meet you there." Harv nodded, thanking her. Before heading to the elevator, his palms were sweating, and he wiped them on his pants, taking a deep breath. As the elevator doors opened, the ride up felt like forever, the hum of the machinery echoing in the small space. When the door slid open, Mr. Thompson was standing there, smiling warmly. "Harv, glad you made it," Mr. Thompson said, extending his hand. Harv shook it, his voice a little shaky. "Thanks for having me, Mr. Thompson. I really appreciate this." Mr. Thompson waved a hand dismissively. "No need to thank me, Harv. I'm just glad to have a man like you on board. Let's go to my office, and we'll get started." Mr. Thompson led Harv down the hall to a spacious office, the walls lined with framed certificates and photos of Mr. Thompson, with various people all smiling. Mr. Thompson gestured for Harv to sit, and he took a seat across from the large wooden desk. "Harv," Mr. Thompson began, leaning back in his chair, "I don't just hire anyone. I hire people who I know have a good heart, people who are willing to do the right thing even when it's tough. You proved that to me when you helped me out in the parking lot." Harv nodded, his throat tight. "I appreciate that, sir. I want to do right by my mom. I want to be someone she can be proud of." Mr. Thompson smiled. "And that's exactly why I want you here. Now, the job I have in mind for you is a bit different from what you did at the mall. It's more responsibility, but it also comes with better pay, benefits, health insurance included." Harv's heart skipped a beat. Health insurance, that was exactly what he needed for his mom. He nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm ready to work hard, sir. Whatever you need." Mr. Thompson nodded, pleased. "I know you are, Harv. We'll start you as a junior supervisor. It's a step up, but I think you've got what it takes. You'll oversee some of our smaller accounts, make sure everything is running smoothly. And don't worry, we'll train you. You won't be on your own." Harv let out of breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Mr. Thompson stood, extending his hand again. "I know you won't." "Welcome to the team, Harv." The next couple of hours were a whirlwind. Mr. Thompson introduced Harv to some of the other staff, gave him a tour of the building, and set him up with the paperwork he needed to fill out. Harv's head was spinning, but in a good way. For the first time in a long time, he felt like things might actually be turning around. He left the building around noon, a folder full of papers tucked under his arm, and a genuine smile on his face. He walked back to the bus, stopped, his steps feeling lighter than they had in weeks. He pulled out his phone, dialing his mom's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Ma." "Guess what?" Harv said, unable to keep the excitement from voice. "What is it, baby?" she asked, her voice curious but tired. "I got the job, Ma. And it's a good one. They're even giving us health insurance." There was a pause on the other end, and then he heard his mom's breath hitch. "Oh, Harv, that's wonderful. I knew you'd do it. I'm so proud of you." Harv swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Ma. I'll be home soon." "Okay, we're going to be all right." When Harv got back to the apartment, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He walked through the door, and his mom was sitting in her chair, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She looked up at him, her smile wide. "There's my boy," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You did it, Harv. I knew you would." Harv crossed the room, kneeling in front of her, taking her hands in his. "We did it, Ma. I couldn't have done it without you." She squeezed his hands, her eyes glistening. "We're going to be all right now, baby. Everything's going to be all right." The next few days were a blur of paperwork and preparation. Harv spent his days at the office, learning the ropes, meeting his new team, and getting a feel for the job. It was challenging, but Harv thrived on it. The work was different from what he was used to, but Mr. Thompson and the rest of the staff were supportive, always ready to help if he had questions. For the first time, Harv felt like he was in an environment where he was valued. The best part was getting his mom back on her medication. Harv took her to the clinic, the weight lifting from his shoulders. As he handed over the new insurance card, the relief on his mother's face made every struggle he'd gone through worth it. One afternoon, as Harv was finishing up some paperwork in his small office, there was a knock on the door. He looked up to see Mr. Thompson standing there, a smile on his face. "Got a minute, Harv?" Mr. Thompson asked. "Of course, sir," Harv replied, standing up. Mr. Thompson stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to let you know you're doing a great job here. The team likes you, and I think you're fitting in just fine." Harv felt a swell of pride. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot to me." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I knew you were the right person for this. You've got heart, Harv, and that's something you can't teach. Just keep doing what you're doing." Harv nodded, his voice steady. "I will, sir." As Mr. Thompson left the office, Harv sat back down, a smile spreading across his face. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he was where he was supposed to be. Harv woke up to a Monday morning that felt different from all the others. The familiar tightness in his chest wasn't there this time. Instead, there was a sense of purpose. He pulled on his new uniform, a dark blue blazer with Thompson Security Services stitched neatly over the pocket. He looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting the collar. It was a simple thing, but it made him feel like he mattered. He felt ready. His mom was sitting at the small kitchen table, her frail hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She smiled when she saw him. "Look at you, all dressed up," she said, her voice filled with pride. Harv grinned. "You like it? Feels different, but in a good way. You look sharp, baby," she said. "They're lucky to have you." He kissed her forehead, grabbing his bag. "I'll be back early today. Ma, we'll have dinner together, okay?" She nodded, her eyes softened. "I'll be here waiting." Harv stepped out of the apartment and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The streets were alive, people bustling to get to work, buses rumbling down the road. This time, Harv felt like he belonged among them. People with a purpose, moving towards something better. At the office, Mr. Thompson greeted him warmly, patting him on the back. "Morning, Harv. Ready for your first real assignment?" "Yes, sir," Harv replied, his voice full of determination. Mr. Thompson smiled and nodded toward a small group of security officers gathered near the main desk. "Today, you'll be shadowing Ted. He's one of my senior supervisors. He'll show you the ropes." Ted was an older guy, probably in his early 50s, with a bushy mustache and a straightforward demeanor. He gave Harv a nod as he approached. "All right, new guy," Ted said, handing Harv a clipboard. "We're covering a few smaller sites today. Just some standard checks. Make sure everything's running smooth. Stick with me. Ask questions if you've got them, and we'll get along fine." Harv nodded, falling in step beside Ted as they headed out to one of the company cars. The drive took them through parts of the city Harv knew well, areas that weren't the nicest but weren't the worst either. As they drove, Ted filled Harv in on the basics: routine patrols, proper documentation, managing incidents. "Most of what we do is prevention," Ted explained, his eyes on the road. "We show up, we make sure things are in order, and we keep problems from becoming big problems. The trick is to be visible, but not in the way." Harv nodded, absorbing every word. It was a different pace from what he'd done before. There was more emphasis on managing people, on being aware of everything without drawing too much attention to yourself. Their first stop was a small office complex. Ted led Harv around, introducing him to the staff, checking the building security systems, and walking the perimeter. Harv watched how Ted interacted with people, friendly but firm, always making sure they knew he was there to help, but also there to enforce the rules. Harv tried to mirror his approach, shaking hands, smiling, making sure his presence was known, but not intimidating. As they walked back to the car, Ted glanced at Harv. "You're catching on quick. Ever think about getting into something more supervisory?" Harv shook his head, surprised. "Not really. I mean, I'm just getting started here. I'm trying to learn as much as I can." Ted grunted in approval. "Good attitude. Keep that up, and you'll go places." Harv smiled, feeling a swell of pride. He'd spent so long feeling like he was barely hanging on that he couldn't even think about moving up. But maybe this was his chance. Maybe he could do more. Their next stop was a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, just a couple of workers moving pallets around. Ted and Harv walked through, Ted making notes on his clipboard. As they finished their round, a young woman approached them, looking nervous. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a guy out back. I think he's trying to break into one of the trucks. Ted's expression hardened, and he nodded to Harv. Come on, let's check it out. They made their way to the back of the warehouse, moving quietly. As they rounded the corner, Harv saw him, a man in his 30s, crouched by one of the trucks, fiddling with the lock. Ted stepped forward, his voice firm. Hey, what do you think you're doing? The man looked up, his eyes wide. He stood quickly, his hands raised. I was just. Ted shook his head, his voice calm but stern. Step away from the truck now. The man hesitated, then took a step back, his hands still in the air. Harv moved to the side, positioning himself between the man and the warehouse entrance. He could feel his heart pounding, the adrenaline rushing through him. But he kept his expression neutral. Ted pulled out his phone, calling in the incident, while keeping his eyes on the man. Harv watched the guy carefully. He didn't seem like a real threat, just desperate, maybe looking for something to steal and sell. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up, 2 officers stepping out. Ted waved them over, explaining the situation. The officers nodded, taking the man aside to question him. Ted looked at Harv, giving a small nod of approval. Good job, Harv, you kept your cool. Harv let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thanks, Ted. Just tried to do what you said, be present, but not in the way. Ted chuckled. You got it, kid. You'll get the hang of this. They finished up the rest of the rounds without any more incidents. By the time they got back to the office, it was late afternoon. Ted parked the car and looked at Harv, his expression serious. You did good today. Harv nodded. Everyone handles their first incident that well. You stayed calm, did what needed to be done. That's what we need around here. Harv felt a rush of pride. Nodding, thank you, Ted. I appreciate it. Ted clapped him on the shoulder. Keep it up, kid. You've got a future here. Harv walked back into the building, his head held high. Mr. Thompson was waiting by the front desk, and he gave Harv a smile as he approached. How'd it go? Mr. Thompson asked. Good, sir. We had a small incident, but everything went smoothly, Harv replied. Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes twinkling. I knew I made the right choice bringing you on board. Harv, keep up the good work, and there will be more opportunities for you here. Harv smiled, shaking Mr. Thompson's hand. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. When Harv got home that night, he was exhausted, but in the best way. He walked into the apartment, and his mom looked up, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. Hey, baby, she said, her voice filled with warmth. How was it? Harv grinned, sitting down beside her. It was good, ma, really good. I think I'm finally getting somewhere. She reached out, taking his hand. I always knew you would, Harv. You've got a good heart, people. See that? Harv squeezed her hand, his smile softening. Thanks, ma. I'm just trying to do right by you. She nodded, her eyes misting over. You're doing more than enough, baby. I'm so proud of you. Harv looked at her, the weight of everything he'd been through suddenly feeling lighter. He was finally on the right path, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Harv woke up, ready for his first official day as a supervisor. It was early, the world still quiet, but there was something about this silence that felt different. It wasn't empty or hopeless, but full of potential. He got ready, quickly putting on his uniform with a sense of pride that hadn't been there in a long time. He glanced at his mother, still asleep, her breathing steady, and he knew that today would be different. Today he had a real purpose. The ride to the office was filled with a buzz of nervous energy, but it was a good kind of nervousness, something akin to excitement. Harv arrived at the office just as the sun was climbing up, spilling warm light over the city streets. Mr. Thompson was already in as usual, greeting Harv with a warm smile. Morning, Harv, he said, clapping him on the shoulder. First day of supervisor, you ready for it? Harv nodded, his smile stretching across his face. Absolutely, sir. Mr. Thompson handed him a small stack of documents. Good. I'm putting you in charge of our team for the day. Nothing too complicated, just some routine rounds and handling a few of our accounts. I want to see how you take the lead. Harv took the documents, his chest swelling with both pride and a hint of anxiety. He couldn't afford to mess this up. He followed Mr. Thompson down the hallway, meeting up with the team in the briefing room. The group of officers was smaller today, just 3 others, Ted, whom Harv had worked with before, and 2 newer recruits, Casey and Mike. All right, team, Mr. Thompson began, gesturing to Harv. Harv is going to be your lead today. He'll walk you through the rounds, handle any issues, and I expect you all to follow his direction. Got it? There were nods from the group, and Mr. Thompson smiled at Harv. Good luck, Harv. I know you'll do just fine. Harv stepped forward, his hands just barely trembling as he flipped through the documents. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "All right, folks, we've got a few stops today. An office building downtown, a storage facility out by the industrial district, and a small event at a hotel that we're providing coverage for. Nothing too intense. But let's stay alert." Ted gave him a nod of approval, and Casey and Mike both smiled. It made Harv feel a little more confident, the nerves settling into something more manageable. He led the group out to the company van, taking the driver's seat. The others piled in, and they set off towards their first stop. The office building downtown was their first assignment. It was a straightforward patrol, but Harv approached it with the seriousness he knew was expected. He led the team inside, greeting the office workers. As they moved through the floors, Casey handled the entry lock, while Mike walked the perimeter. Ted stayed close to Harv, offering a few quiet suggestions here. "And there, remember, the key is visibility." Ted said, his voice low. "Let the staff see you, show them you're there, but don't hover." Harv nodded, making a conscious effort to follow Ted's advice. He made his rounds, speaking briefly to a few staff members, offering polite smiles, and keeping his presence known but unobtrusive. By the time they finished their rounds, Harv felt a growing sense of accomplishment. It wasn't flashy work, but it mattered, and it was his responsibility to do it right. Their next stop was the storage facility. Harv had never been to this particular location before, and as they pulled into the lot, he noticed how quiet it was. Rows of shipping containers and warehouse units stretched out, the whole area almost eerily silent. "All right, we're going to split up," Harv said, glancing back at the team. "Casey, you and Mike take the left side, Ted, and I will take the right. Let's do a thorough walk around, make sure everything's in order." The team nodded, and they moved out, splitting into pairs. Harv walked along inside Ted, their footsteps echoing off the concrete. They checked the units, testing locks, making sure everything was secure. As they rounded a corner, Harv noticed something, a container door slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. "Ted, you see that?" Harv asked, pointing to the container. Ted's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, that doesn't look right." They approached cautiously, Harv's heart beginning to pound. He grabbed the handle, slowly pulling the door open. Inside the container was dark stacks of boxes lining the walls. But something was off. One of the boxes was open, its contents scattered across the floor. Harv knelt down, picking up a small metal part. "Looks like someone's been here," he muttered, glancing at Ted. Ted nodded. "Yeah, this doesn't look like a break-in. It's too clean, more like someone was looking for something specific." Harv stood, his jaw tightening. "We need to report this. Let's get back to the van." They'd regrouped with Casey and Mike, explaining what they'd found. Harv called in the report to Mr. Thompson, detailing the suspicious activity. "Good work, Harv," Mr. Thompson said over the phone, his voice calm. "Make sure the container is secured and finish up there. I'll send someone to follow up." Harv hung up, turning back to the team. "All right, let's secure that container and move on." Mr. Thompson sending someone else to look into it. They made their way back to the container, Harv securing the lock, while Ted jotted down the details in their log. It wasn't a major incident, but Harv felt the weight of responsibility, a sense that what they did here mattered. They moved on, leaving the storage facility behind. As they headed to their final assignment, the event at the hotel was a different kind of challenge. It was a business conference, suits and ties, name tags, and a lot of small talk. Harv found himself in the lobby, scanning the crowd, his eyes moving from face to face. The atmosphere was busy, people moving in all directions, and Harv knew the key here was to blend in while staying alert. He positioned himself near the entrance, watching as people came and went. Casey and Mike took up positions near the conference rooms, while Ted moved through the halls, keeping an eye on things. Harv could feel the tension in his shoulders, but it was a good kind of tension, the kind that kept him focused. He noticed a man standing near the entrance, his eyes darting around nervously. The man was dressed in a suit, but something about his demeanor caught Harv's attention. He wasn't talking to anyone, just standing there, his gaze shifting back and forth. Harv moved closer, keeping his eyes on the man. "Excuse me, sir," Harv said, his voice polite but firm. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked at Harv, his eyes widening slightly. "Oh, no, I'm just waiting for someone," he stammered. Harv nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "All right, just let me know if you need anything." The man nodded, quickly turning and walking away. His steps hurried. Harv watched him for a moment before stepping back, his eyes